Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Brandon R. Schrand. His last name is spelled Schrand. I finally kind of tracked him down. We've kind of been bouncing around, but I really wanted to interview him about this book that I came across. The title of the book that he published in March 2021 is Psychiana Man, a mail order prophet, his followers, and the power of belief in hard times. And a terrific book, really a great read, very artfully put together, very well researched, which he can talk about. This is not his first book. He's also written works cited in Alphabetical Odyssey of Mayhem and Misbehavior in 2013, and also The Ender's Hotel, a memoir, and that was published in 2008, and that won the River Teeth Literary Nonfiction Prize. But his work has appeared in a lot of papers and magazines, including Sports Illustrated, the Dallas Morning News, the Utne Reader, Tin House, Shenandoah, the Georgia Review, North American Review, Boulevard, the Missouri Review, Columbia River Teeth Ecotone, and numerous other publications. He's done a lot of essays and he's an essayist. So he's been in anthologies, including Born on Air, Essays by Idaho Writers, Now Write Nonfiction Writing Exercises from Today's Best Writers and Teachers, and The Book of Dads, Essays on the Joys, Perils, and Humiliations of Fatherhood. He has won the Willard R. Espy Award, Shenandoah's Carter Prize, the Pushcart Prize, 4 Pushcart Prize special mentions, and has had 7 notable essays in the Best American Essay Series. His nonfiction has also been longlisted for Notting Hill's Hazlitt Prize, and he has earned a Yaddo residency. And he lives in Moscow, Idaho, where a lot of this takes place. So, and his website is his full name, brandonschrand.com. So, Brandon Schrand, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, for people who may not have heard your background, you have a long background, a lot of writing. Can you talk kind of about your other writing and what led you to write this book, Psychiana Man?
Yeah, sure. So I started out writing personal essays, which led me to write a memoir about my upbringing, growing up in a boomtown hotel in southern Idaho. We owned a hotel, restaurant, and a bar, and it's kind of a working class establishment. And I come from a working class family and only child, and I spent my formative years watching these people kind of move in and out of our lives. And so I started out with my first book as a memoir. The second book kind of picks up where the first one left off, but it's organized as a kind of bibliography, right? So all the books that were important in my life sort of frame the narrative, and I thought that would be an interesting way to put a book together. So that was Works Cited, which came out in 2013, as you had mentioned, and then I was just kind of wanting to try my hand at narrative nonfiction. And I was casting around for a subject, and I kind of stumbled across Psychiana, this mail order religion that started in Moscow, Idaho, in my own backyard. I had never heard of it. And I was just thumbing through a local history book, and I saw this brief chapter in there about this man, Frank Robinson, who started this mail order religion, kind of a new thought, iteration of new thought back in the Great Depression. And it turns out he made kind of a fortune off of folks who were looking for hope wherever they could find it. And the fact that he made a lot of money sort of turned a lot of people off. They kind of cast him in the light as a charlatan. And that's certainly how I saw him going into the book. And my mind changed a little bit about him. I don't think he was just a monolithic bad guy. I think he was a lot more complex than that. And so that's how I got to the subject. But the research took, I don't know, some 7 years. It was a slog to go through all the letters from the students, of which there are thousands of pages still at the University of Idaho archives. So it was a lot of fun. It was a labor of love, and it was nice not to write about myself for a while.
Interesting. And so for people who hadn't heard his name, I had honestly never heard of this character, Frank Bruce Robinson. Can you talk about his start and how he ended up in Moscow, all the way to Moscow, Idaho?
So his origin story is complex and interesting, and is really kind of tied to the conception of his movement and sort of haunted him. And what I mean by that is that Frank Bruce Robinson was born in England 1886, in a village just 8 miles from where Shakespeare was born in Henley and Arden. He was the son of a pastor, a kind of a firebrand pastor. He was one of 5 boys. His mother died early, and Frank had a very contentious relationship with his father. And for reasons that remain to me inexplicable, Frank's father sent Frank and his one brother Sidney, put him into the home children program. And if you're not familiar with that, this was a program, 19th century, maybe even into the 20th. Well, yeah, into the 20th century, where the children of prostitutes, criminals, drug addicts, alcoholics were kind of rounded up and sent to either Canada to kind of live in these homes and work, or they were sent to Australia, South Africa. And Frank and his brother, they did not come from a home of prostitutes, ne'er-do-wells, criminals, or the like. They came from a fairly well-to-do, educated home, man of the ministry. So why his father sent him off is a mystery to me. He ended up in Canada as a young boy, about 16, 17 years old, and really there began a life of self-invention. He was kind of chameleonic. He would kind of invent his story as he went. And he bounced around Canada working as a druggist, losing one job, getting another job. He was early on alcoholic. He joined various branches of the Canadian military, the Northwest Mounted Police, and then in about 1910 crossed in the United States and joined the U.S. Navy, claiming that he'd been born in New York City. And that becomes an important point in the book. He sort of lied about where he came from. And it caused some trouble when he was accused of passport fraud later on. But, he came to the United States, started out in Portland, Oregon, moved around into Washington State, down into San Francisco. He did a short bit in the U.S. Army under the name Earl Meyer in the Philippines, and then was, for, again, reasons that are not exactly clear, he was court-martialed and sent to Alcatraz for 6 months, got out and tromped the streets of San Francisco. And it was there that he sobered up, bounced around into Oregon, decided to settle down in Klamath Falls, met a judge's daughter, Florence Levitt, fell in love, got married against his soon-to-be father-in-law's wishes. He was 14 years older than his wife. Murky background, specious credentials, just kind of a fabulist. But it was in those early years that he stumbled across the idea of starting his own religion. And he wanted to find a druggist job where he could be done at 6 o'clock at night and work on his religion after that. There happened to be an opening in a drugstore in Moscow, Idaho. So they moved from Oregon to Moscow and then remained there until his death in 1948.
Right. So he made it all the way to Moscow, and he was the kind of like you said, chameleonic or reinventing himself. He was a druggist, moved from job, stockbroker, kind of bouncing around a lot, kind of shiftless. So how did his timing of creating this thing, Psychiana, was really on point, right? I mean, the timing was right for this kind of new age.
Absolutely. And I don't think that it would have been as successful had it been started really in any other time. So he got to Moscow. He wrote these lessons on a borrowed typewriter. He wrote 20 lessons. His idea was to sell these lessons at $1 per lesson. And $1 back in 1929, $25 there about today. And that was, a fairly good bit of money at the time. Now, he started this. He put his first ad in Psychology magazine that said, I talked with God, you can too. And it was a really simple ad. He anticipated a few responses. He got flooded with responses, got inundated with folks that sent in $1, wanted the lesson, and then he would send out other lessons. He started in a little, basically like a tiny workroom above the drugstore, and his wife helped him. And then he expanded out with some borrowed money from some local businessmen in Moscow. And it was moving right along, but it was really kind of an unforeseen venture capitalist, if you will, from Egypt, a British cotton broker named Jeffrey Peel Burley, that had enrolled in Psychiana, wrote to Robinson, said, I love this. Robinson, on a lark, said, well, if you love it, that's great. Send me $40,000. And Burley did. Had it not been for that massive cash infusion at the time, I don't think it would really have taken off. But it really was this idea of, Frank's notion, Robinson's notion of conventional faith is he didn't have a lot of patience with it. Stemming, I think, a lot from his father, who was a preacher, and he's kind of thumbing his nose at his father, but he wanted to start something that was radically different than conventional religion. He sort of raised the ire of the clergy by saying, the story of Jesus is not unique. There's a lot of saviors in ancient texts that have this kind of resurrection story and that kind of thing. And so he sort of thumbed his nose at conventional religion as well. And, at a time when folks, they couldn't trust the banks. Banks were failing. They didn't trust the government. They felt like the government had failed them. They couldn't trust, really authority. Everything around them that was conventional and had stood by them traditionally was faltering. And so it wasn't unsurprising that a lot of people really turned to an alternative belief system to find some semblance of hope in an otherwise dark time. And it became more so throughout the Great Depression.
Right. So the Great Depression, if you put a date on it, it was like 29, and then 6 weeks later, I think in your book, or very soon after his first mailing, and he had somehow learned all those lessons from salesmanship in getting these advertisements out. Can you talk about, you mentioned the New Thought movement. Can you kind of expand on who his influences were when he kind of put together Psychiana and how he came up with the title?
Yeah. So his Psychiana is by and large derivative of a number of various religions. He was influenced a bit by Christian Science. He was influenced by, I would say, more than anyone, Robert Collier, who wrote The Secret of the Ages, a set of 20 slim volumes published in the early 20s. And he really kind of saw, I think, my supposition is he saw Robert Collier not only as selling the idea of affirmations, positive thinking, before we really had that term, positive thinking, and he saw Collier was making a good deal of money on it. Robinson was an opportunist. He'd done everything from, stockbroker, writing ads in Hollywood, to door-to-door sales in Portland, Oregon. So he saw this idea of marketing and a capitalistic system and religion as really hand in glove. And he wasn't the only one, but he really drew a lot of influence from Robert Collier, Ernest Holmes later on. But early on, I would say most of it stemmed from Robert Collier.
Right. And I think you mentioned Haenel's master key system. So you kind of see that kind of system.
Right.
He's putting it together.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So Charles Haenel was another one where, in fact, in the book, Frank used a lot of the same lingo that these guys were using at the time. A lot of the same verbiage. They kind of had their own organizational, jargon, and Frank was really kind of borrowing pretty pretty heavily from a lot of that. You know, again, if you look at the notion of self-help in America, you can really trace it back to the Great Depression. It's really kind of the genesis of the self-help movement in America. It's when AA started, right? And so there was this kind of hunger and a kind of a new way to, you know, self-assess, and a lot of really savvy, you know, businessmen by and large saw that opportunity. Bruce Barton was another one, and Frank Robinson wasn't the first, but he was one of a number of people that saw this as an apt and opportune time to kind of you know, sell their ideas.
And how did he come up with the name Psychiana? Wasn't there some kind of spiritual event he had or claimed he had?
So that's an interesting story. All we have is Frank's word for it, but according to him, he had a dream that he walked into a room that was all painted black, and there was a man lying on a cot with his arms crossed over his chest, and there was someone standing over him and saying, you know, we are in a spiritually dead world, and I'm just kind of going off memory here. This is Psychiana, you know what it is. Frank later claimed that the man in the dream telling him that they were living in a spiritually dead world, and that he was looking at this corpse, this man representing the spiritually dead world. And he started, the name Psychiana came out of that dream. And the man talking to him in his dream was Jeffrey Peel Burley, the cotton merchant who gave him their $40,000. It's kind of a weird story, but that was Frank's explanation for how he got the name. And I believe he came out of the dream and shook his wife awake and said, "I know the name. It's Psychiana." And you know, he knew, either in a preternatural way or from his training, he knew all about branding, and Psychiana became the brand, and he really ran with that, took it seriously as well.
And he had that idea of science. So this new psychology, or I think you write in your book that he believed that evolution was science, and that was the science. This kind of new scientific religion overcomes the pretensions of Christianity. There's a lot of attacking of Christianity, it seemed to be to me in your book, like at least in Psychiana. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. Well, he was very, very vocal about attacking Psychiana, calling it, you know, a dogma from the Dark Ages and a history steeped in blood. And he was very provocative about the way he cast conventional Christianity. And, you know, a lot of it had to do with being provocative for provocative's sake. But I think he also really, that much I think he really believed in. You know, he'd done a brief stint in Toronto Bible College, dropped out. He just didn't have any faith in the story of Jesus, the Immaculate Conception, the resurrection, or any of that. And started really reading a lot of, he was a voracious reader, and he read a lot about world religions. And I think that's how he came to a lot of his early conceptions of why he thought Christianity was just, you know, kind of bunk in his view.
Right. He said it was associated with violence, so he took that. And I think in some of his, you have it in your appendix, these 20 or Psychiana lessons. And one of them is these whole things from past history, the other people who had been crucified and things like that. So he really was not in that. And it's interesting in your book, you mention a couple other people who you kind of see Robinson in their lens, which was Joseph Smith and L. Ron Hubbard. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that occurred to me as I was reading about the structure of Psychiana is what I call a pay to pray religion. You know, you pay $1 for a lesson. Lesson 1, it's lesson 1 through 20 is the first series, and there's the advanced lessons, and then there's the new lessons, the new advanced lessons, and it's just on and on and on, and you have to keep paying to go and to get, more enlightened. And I was thinking, what's a contemporary analog? And Scientology popped into my mind. And L. Ron Hubbard wrote Dianetics, that published in 1952, which was the same year that Psychiana closed. And when Robinson was advertising Psychiana early on, there's he kept a whole book of all the magazines that he published in, and they were all pulp magazines, science fiction, detective magazines, Western magazines, and they were literally the same magazines that L. Ron Hubbard was publishing short fiction in back in the day. Now, I looked for like any sort of direct line that like L. Ron Hubbard saw Psychiana ads and then patterned Scientology after that. I never found such a smoking gun. But the similarities are pretty clear in at least the structure of, graduate higher up through the order of Psychiana, self-actualization, a kind of dismissive attitude toward modern day psychology, although Frank's a little more ambiguous in his stance on that than say Hubbard was. But yeah, I mean, they were both their personal lives were very similar in that, they were both in the Navy. They both had questionable military history. They both had a fabulous point of, kind of sense of themselves. They just sort of invented, their past out of thin air. They didn't have any problem about exaggerating and fictionalizing their own backstory. And a lot of people said, obviously these people, this guy's a con man, or people said, oh, this guy's a genius. And so they both kind of walked that same line. And, Joseph Smith starting out, his backstory is just as kind of murky as Robinson's, right? And it's having kind of grown up in the LDS culture, not as a member of the faith, but just in the culture, the closer you try to get to Joseph Smith's story, the farther you feel like you are away from it. And I felt like that with Frank Robinson. And when Fawn Brodie wrote I think the seminal biography on Joseph Smith, No Man Knows My History, that was really kind of the leading thesis in her book, was she wanted to really get to who he was, and it cost her place in that religion. So I found some interesting parallels there as well.
Right. And I think all three of them tied their teaching with money, because I think the Mormon church is they're not very ascetic in the sense of like eschewing financial. It's the other thing. It's a proof of like your status is your ability to make money. So these guys were not the kind of suffering servant types, at least if you put them all together. The other thing that I think is curious is that I didn't know that about Robinson. I was surprised at what his global reach was. And it's kind of similar with all these other, with Mormonism and Scientology, is that they really kind of had a very strong kind of sales component to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he didn't stay in Moscow. One of the interesting things is he went to the Masonic Hall and gave a speech. I think it was in Spokane or somewhere in Washington. Can you talk about this? Like he also went to LA. I thought it was interesting. Can you talk about some of his travels and how he presented himself?
Yeah. So Frank took his show on the road. I mean, from a business strategy standpoint, one of the great things about Psychiana was that as a mail order religion, it really didn't require a whole lot of bricks and mortar. You didn't have to have churches in every town and that kind of thing. But it did require him to kind of get out on the road and, he went to Los Angeles a number of times. It's one of the cities that he drew the biggest crowds was LA and in Hollywood. And in Portland, Oregon, he had a convention and he spoke in Spokane, and he really liked he liked being on stage. I mean, the guy was a showman through and through. He was charismatic, like Joseph Smith was, like L. Ron Hubbard apparently was. He was charming. He was smart, and he could work a crowd. And when he was feeling kind of down, um, frankly, when his money was running dry, that's when he would hit the road and go do these circuits. And they would have basically a collection plate, and as much money as he made, he was always very quick to say, "This is not about the money. I don't care about the money. I don't care about a nickel or a dime of any of this. I'm doing this for all of you, and I don't make any money off of this." And he doth protest too much on that point, I think, as he's driving around in his 1932 Duesenberg.
Right, which you can see right here on the cover of your book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that car was just so completely over the top. Only A-list celebs, Rudy Valentino were driving these cars, and of course Robinson really liked to. Well, he was a showman, and in that era, what your house and your car were your biggest status symbols. Of course, it's not too different today, but it was very much so then. When Hoover said that, when President Hoover, before the Depression really hit, said, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. That was the American dream. Well, Robinson's car in the garage was a Duesenberg. So, and he used that as proof that Psychiana was, worked for him, and it can work for everybody else. If I can drive this car, you can too. It was always tied back to the money.
And one of the fascinating aspects of your book is how many people, the notes and the correspondence you included of people with Robinson, and he had people who were convinced that what he had made was working. You mentioned the name of the early guy, Geoffrey Peel Burley in England, but there were lots of other people who interacted with him in Psychiana, right?
Yeah. So one of the things I was really just totally impressed by, and made me kind of scratch my head and go, okay, well, let me put it this way. When I first dug into this, I'm like, what kind of people would believe this? This is just kind of, nonsense. But then you start reading the letters from the students, and they're from all walks of life. You have the very articulate and literary to the very almost barely literate, who are members of this faith, all of them crediting successes, small and large, in their lives to Frank Robinson and Psychiana. And they were all, as you had mentioned, they were all over the world. I mean, there was students in the Philippines and in The Hague, and students in England, and all corners. And the reach was wide, and he the bigger that it got, he had to bring on more staff, and Psychiana kind of grew exponentially in downtown Moscow. So there were a lot of buildings, and he had the largest local base of employees outside of the university. He was the largest employer. So it forced the small town of Moscow, Idaho, it split the town. People there, like, well, on the one hand, he's providing all these jobs to get these mailings out all over the world. On the other hand, Moscow was fairly embarrassed to be known as the place where Psychiana started. So, he had quite a reach, and he was a bit of a divisive figure even back at home.
Right. So he had conflicts with some of the people in the town. I think you wrote like half the town is for them, half is against. But you show the pictures in your book. He's employing tons of women. You got to remember, at that time, it's not an era of computers. You had to have women typing out all of the response letters and the correspondence and all that. So maybe that's one thing you can talk is about the research you did, because there is a lot of research there in Idaho on this person, right? On Robinson.
Yeah. So there, when Frank Robinson's eldest son, Alfred, he had all of the papers, and he gave one trove to the local historical society and another trove to the University of Idaho. And most of those materials were under seal until I think 1980 or 82, somewhere in there. They unsealed those. That included a lot of the letters from the students from around the world. There are still 5 boxes under seal that won't be opened until 2024. So I'm very interested to see what might be in there. I have a suspicion, but I'm not sure, of course. So the research part was reading. He wrote about 25 books, and he self-published these by and large. And all of his books are pretty much autobiographical. So it's really difficult to say this is where the man ends and the religion begins. His biography is inextricably linked to his religion, because he was the exemplum of Psychiana. I am successful because of Psychiana, so I have to tell you my story, was kind of his whole MO. So part of the research process was reading through those books, reading through the lessons, reading through the advertisements, of which there were, thousands. Then reading about self-help in America, reading about other kind of similar religions that were, going on at the same time, other religious, leaders, learning about New Thought, just trying to get my head around that, plus the dynamics of the Great Depression itself, and then situating the students within that context so that readers wouldn't be as quick to dismiss them as, oh, I can't believe you bought into the Psychiana stuff. When, if you put yourself in their shoes, which is kind of what I wanted to do in the book by researching these students and trying to find as much about each of the individual students as I could to make them real, so they weren't so easy to dismiss as like, oh, you're a crackpot, I really kind of felt for some of these students. So I would dive in and try to contact family members, and I'm writing about your great grandmother. Did you know she was a member of this religion? Do you have any photographs? Do you have any stories? And I would have to go through all the letters to find students whose stories I felt were kind of, traceable and storyable, that I could put in here as vignettes, kind of along a chronological timeline, and you've got students that, I thought that I would find students that would be like, you know what, Frank, this thing's crap. I want out. I want my money back. Cause he said, your money back guarantee religion. Right. Nobody asked that I found for their money back. Of course, to do so would have meant that they had been duped in the first place. And in fact, the opposite sort of happened. You had people that groused a little bit, like, I have no idea if you even read my letters, Dr. Robinson, but let me tell you what good Psychiana has done for me. You'd have people a little bit miffed that they felt like they were kind of being, it was form rejection or form letters type of thing, and not really a person behind it. And yet they still hung on. And I really was compelled by that. So tracking down the individual stories of the students was a really kind of hard slog to get through. Of course, when I reached out to some family members and told them what I was doing, they never returned my emails after saying their relative was, part of Psychiana. Some were very forthcoming. A lot of it I just found on Ancestry and was able to kind of put together the pieces. But I really wanted to kind of create a sort of almanac, for lack of a better word, of that era and that time of what was going on and people's fears and worries and concerns. And, they felt like they didn't have anywhere else to turn. And, they saw Psychiana, and so why not? Even some preachers were members of Psychiana. So all of them, yeah.
And you mentioned like a Presbyterian minister in Moscow who was curious about it as a movement, but wasn't super critical. One of the interesting things I think the movement or Psychiana overlapped with was an interest in occultism too. So you have a little bit of segment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I didn't know a whole lot about the occult prior to really digging into the Psychiana story. There was a book that I had looked into I want to think it was called Cult America or something, but there was a slim chapter in there on Frank Robinson, and it got me thinking about Psychiana and the larger context of the occult, or the attraction to the occult. And because I was sort of rather ignorant of the occult and its place in American and world history, particularly in the 1930s, I was sort of surprised, pleasantly surprised from a researcher point of view, that the occult wasn't really like a dodgy undertaking of some back alley ne'er-do-wells. Like the occult was, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was all about it. I mean, intellectuals, artists, movie stars, writers, they were all very much interested in mediumships and the occult and seances and that kind of thing, just as a matter of practice. And it was not fringe, I don't think, really. It was almost a little more mainstream than I think I really thought it was, at least among some of the intelligentsia of the time. And Psychiana kind of rubbed up against that a little bit. Frank was part of the American Psychical, I think it's the American Psychical Association.
Research, ASPR. Yeah, the American Society for Psychical Research.
That's right. So ASPR, he was a member of that group, which I believe is still going. And there's I
think so. I think you're right.
Yeah. And so, he was part of that. He rubbed up against it a little bit. I don't know how active he was in it. He got the newsletter from them. Some of his students asked about mediumships, that kind of thing. He certainly was very, interested in it. He didn't discount it outright. And so, Psychiana does fit in that kind of, that interesting segment in time where the occult was kind of chic and kind of popular.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you wrote directly at the occult at that time was good business. And I think it goes in kind of cyclical phases into the 19th century, then back up and down, kind of 60s. I think maybe it comes around now. Yeah. It was interesting too, because you mentioned somebody who I knew was Cecil. We talked about this in the pre-show, Cecil Frederick Russell. Can you talk a little bit about why you put him in this book, Psychiana Man?
Well, that was just a fun, happy discovery. I was going through, again, part of the research, I was going through the ads and the publications, the many publications that Psychiana put out, and one of them was Psychiana Quarterly. And Frank started selling ad space to bring in revenue for these. And one of the ads that he sold was to Cecil Frederick Russell, who put an ad for I think it was called the Corazon Club.
Corazon was the demon that Crowley interacted with in Algeria. So
okay, thank you. Yeah. And I was just like, what is this? Yeah, I was like, what is this? And so down the rabbit hole I go. And I had a passing interest in Crowley myself ever since I was kind of a teenager, and I just thought that was a fascinating little connection there. And again, it pointed back to really Psychiana was part of this, or fit into this larger context of the occult. And I had no idea that Russell was apparently an early student of Crowley's, from what I understand, an early pupil.
Who went to the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, Sicily. So he was very well known, and his name is very present. And they had a lot of conflicts. And I think you're right. Crowley kicked him out of the magical fraternity. He kind of went his own way. I think he actually tried to build on what made Crowley irked. Is that Russell tried to build onto the Book of the Law with his own Book of the Law, and Crowley would have nothing. Yeah, so that kind of got him excommunicated. Brandon, do you mind taking a few questions? We're about 40 minutes. Somebody's asked one. How much did Robinson charge, and how much did he make?
So initially, again, it was $1 per lesson, and so $20 would get you the full set of lessons. And then he sold other things, like he created the Psychiana Brotherhood, which you could get into for, I think, $2.50. And then he started creating his own like doctoral degrees, which would cost, I can't remember, maybe $20. And it took a while to, a series of lessons to build up to the degree that he could confer upon you. There were other clubs that Psychiana clubs that you could be part of. He was working on the Order of Eternal Life, and that was maybe $5 to join. And he was also trying to sell his books. So his books would go for about $2, $2.50 a pop. It doesn't sound like much now, but when you have, reach into about 67 countries around the world, and they're all sending in their dollars and their $2 here and there, it added up. And, he made a good deal of money. He had a very, he had a very nice home. It wasn't extravagant, but it was very nice. It was very comfortable. He had a pipe organ installed in it. Like I said, he drove a Duesenberg as well as a Auburn and a Supercharge. He had all these fancy cars, but he had a lot of legal issues that dogged him throughout his life. He was always outrunning the Securities Exchange Commission, or the postal inspector for mail fraud, or a number of the Better Business Bureau, and his and the immigration services were after him for passport fraud, for saying he was from New York when he was from England, and that really chewed up his revenue. So he did want to go on to create a brick and mortar temple in Hollywood, but it never came to pass because his money was going straight to his lawyers. So that's how he got his money. That's how much he charged. That's roughly, some of the internal documents said they'd make about $32,000 within a quarter, 3-month period or so. So he was bringing in a lot of cash, but he also spent it pretty quickly on infrastructure, payroll, and legal fees.
Gotcha. And did they have any rituals in this religion? Did you know of anything like internal things they had to do or anything like that?
Yeah, good question. The only thing that really they had is he had this thing called, look for the white spot or the bright spot. And it was kind of a relaxation technique where you close your eyes and you look for kind of like a bright, white light or a veil through your eyelids, and you focus on that and you say, I believe in the power of the living God. And you just kind of say that over and over again for a while. That was one that they did. In the height of World War II, Frank always trying to hook his religion up to the contemporary news situation, what was going on in the world. He did a Psychiana blitzkrieg against Hitler, where he'd have his students get together, or they would have to get in a quiet spot in their house at 6 p.m., I think, and repeat like 30 times, I believe the power of the living God will bring Hitler to a speedy end, or something like that. So that was one. But outside of those kind of affirmation exercises, there wasn't really anything ritualistic.
And then one more question: is any famous people involved in this?
Yeah. So Tommy Burns, who was the former world heavyweight champion boxer from Canada, was an ardent member of Psychiana. He had Psychiana on his business card and corresponded with Frank quite a bit. Tommy Burns was known for, quote, crossing the color line back in the day when only white fighters would fight white fighters, and colored fighters, they were called, would fight others, colored fighters. And Tommy Burns crossed the color line, took a lot of heat for it. And he was an ardent member. There was, I'm trying to remember, there was a singer by the last name of Burr, and I'm forgetting his first name. He wrote a song that was in Boardwalk Empire called Buddy, I think.
Interesting.
He was a member. Red Skelton was reported to have been a member. There's a picture of Red Skelton with Frank Robinson, but I couldn't find any documentation, a letter or anything like that from Red Skelton to verify that. So Robinson could very easily just had a photo taken with him and then told his students that Red Skelton was a member. I could very easily seeing that happen. Yeah, so there were some notable people. Those were probably the most notable people.
Notice most well known. We're at about 45 minutes, Brandon. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap up the interview?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think so. I think that it's easy to see this as an oddity that occurred in the Great Depression throughout World War II, and it's hermetically sealed to that time and place. But I think that there's a lot of things going on today where you sit back and you say, how would anybody believe X or Y or Z? And that's still going on today, and Frank Robinson was just an early iteration of that. And so I think it behooves us to kind of break down the context of what's going on and see why people believe what they believe. That was always, I'm not a religious man, as I write in the book, so I'm always fascinated by the power of belief in so far as, either organized religion or something like this. So
this
that
guy
would be
can fit. Yeah, I would say this guy fits into the QAnon phenomenon where they're reading missives, they're totally believing, fits into UFO culture, a lot of internet subgroups. I mean, this is very important kind of precedent for the present, in my opinion. And that's what I was thinking when I was reading through.
Yeah, I thought of QAnon exactly.
Like the occultism, the kind of overlapping things, kind of self-helpish too. So really well done. And it's very well researched. You have a lot of pictures and very, very well written. It's one of those books that you come across that's artfully done. Like some are just put together, but this one I think is really exceptional. So congrats to you. Where's the best place to get Psychiana Man?
I think probably the best place is probably Amazon. That's probably the easiest place to go, or at WSU, Washington State University Press. You can Google that and you can order it straight from them.
And if people want to reach out to you, it's your website, brandonschrand.com, correct?
That's right. Yep.
And I'll put that in the show notes so if anybody wants to reach out more. But thanks so much for your time. Really well done. Really interesting book. Very timely. I think it fits into a lot of things that are happening today. Very good piece of Americana, too. That's kind of another way I would describe it. So, again, the author's name is Brandon R. Schrand. Full website is Brandon Schrand, SCHRAND.com. Title of the book, Psychiana Man, a mail order prophet, his followers, and the power of belief in hard times. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
All right, stay there.